Now we're going to talk about the supply side. So if we're talking about supply, we're thinking of firms producing goods or services and supplying them to the market, selling them in the market. So the beginning of this slide says, if a firm supplies a good or service, the firm has the resources and the technology to produce it, can profit from producing it, and has made a definite plan to produce and sell it. All true. Perhaps it helps us understand or think about what supply is more deeply, but that I would just leave it at that. It is true, as it says in the second paragraph, that where we are in terms of what resources we have, what the state of technology is, that certainly determines what it's possible to produce. So resources and technology are important on the supply side. Okay, all of this is introductory and it hasn't really got us to the nitty-gritty, which is where I want us to get to. Okay, so let's just look at the third paragraph. So the quantity supplied of a good or service is the amount that producers to plan to sell during a given time period. So the quantity supplied, how much stuff, I use that word stuff a lot, and it's just a slang word, but what quantity of goods and services a producer wants to supply, to sell in a particular time period. That's what we're talking about. And the basic relationship, the most important relationship that we want to identify up front is the relationship between the price of a good or service and the quantity that's going to be supplied. And we'll think about this in terms of the market. Okay. Now, I don't really believe that there's such a thing as the law of supply. Perhaps it's a phrase that's come into usage. It certainly doesn't exist in the same way as the law of demand. But anyway, if there is a law of supply, the idea is the higher is the price of a good, the more is supplied, the greater is the quantity supplied. Ceteris paribus, everything else being held constant. So the idea is, just to remind you, firms are not setting their own prices in the world that we're describing. They're price takers. So the price is being determined by market forces, which we're kind of coming to, we're building up to. But what we're saying here is that the price which is determined elsewhere, the higher is that price, basically the more profitable it is for firms to produce a bit more stuff, so they want to supply more. So underlying this idea, there is a theory, there's more explanation, more reasoning that we're not giving you at the moment. Okay, the second paragraph kind of hints as to what it is, but we're not really ready to receive this information yet, I don't think. So it says, basically, the reason why the quantity supplied goes up as the price goes up is, and it says, as a result of the general tendency for the marginal cost of producing a good to increase as the quantity is increased. Okay, just don't worry about that for now. You could make a little note that that's going to be explained. Maybe in week 4 or 5, we're going to understand that better. But for now, it doesn't matter. If you say to yourselves, when the price goes up, it's more profitable for the firm to produce more. That'll do. It's a fudge, but it's true. It's just not explained. Okay, so the way in which this idea is represented in economics, generally speaking, is as a graph. So here we've got the supply curve shown on our graph, and the axes are the same as they were with the demand curve. So on the vertical axis, we've got the price per unit. So in this case, it's the price per energy drink. And on the horizontal axis, we've got the quantity, exactly the same as before, quantity, millions of drinks per week. Okay, so if you look at the curve that we have, which is just an example, it says that if the price were 50p, the quantity supplied would be 0. So there wouldn't be any energy drinks forthcoming. If the price were 1, the quantity supplied would be 3. If the price were a bit higher, 150, the quantity supplied would be 4. And you should notice that these are points on the supply curve. So if the price is 150 and the quantity supplied is 4, that's point C on the supply curve. If the price is 2 and the quantity supplied is 5, that's point D on the supply curve. Okay, so the supply curve just joins up these different combinations of price and the quantity that would be supplied. Okay, and just to emphasize which way round it is, it's the price comes first. So given the price, how much will firms supply? It's that way round. Okay, so that's the supply curve. Now, as I say, I've given a kind of fudge reason as to why it slopes upwards, but haven't really explained it properly. But at this point, we're not ready to receive that information. We'd have to go into too much detail about something else. Okay, so what else to say about it? Well, so usually the language we're going to use is when you move along the supply curve because the price has changed, we're going to talk about the quantity supplied having changed. So a higher price causes the quantity supplied to increase. That's the language that we're going to use. In the same way that the demand curve for the market is the sum of individual demand curves, so the supply curve for the market, which is the one we're going to concentrate on, is basically the sum of the supply of all individual sellers. Again, that's an interesting detail, but we don't need to think about that any further. We're not going to ask you to add up individual supply curves. So you can just take that as something that's passed on without worrying about it too much. Okay, and then this slide just emphasizes the business of when the price increases, the quantity supplied goes up. When the price falls, the quantity supplied goes down. All else constant. If you want it in Latin, ceteris paribus. Okay, so it might just be worth thinking about that for a minute or two, just to make sure you've got it. But if you understood the demand curve, it's very similar. So the supply curve will shift if some factor affecting supply, other than a change in price, changes. So if we can think of something that affects supply that isn't the price, then when that thing changes, it's going to shift the supply curve. So in general, anything that increases the supply is going to shift the supply curve to the right, and anything that reduces the supply is going to shift it to the left. Okay, now for me, it's more difficult to think of things that shift the supply curve than the demand curve. The demand curve is kind of easier. But let's take an example. There are going to be more examples in a minute. But suppose that there's a technological breakthrough. So in the supply of fizzy drinks, there's some new process or new machine or new way of doing things that makes it easier to produce energy drinks. What's that going to do? It's going to mean that the firm wants to supply more energy drinks. It's more profitable, let's say, for the firm. It's going to, or costs are lower. It's going to supply more energy drinks, whatever the price is. So whatever the price that the producers can get on the market, they're now going to produce and sell more. And that means the supply curve is going to shift to the right. Okay, suppose that we took another example, not energy drinks, let's say, I'll go back to my carrots, was one of my favorite examples. Suppose that this year in terms of carrots, there's a terrible blight. There's a pest that has eaten all the carrots or half the carrots. What's that going to do to the supply? It's going to reduce it. Supply curve is going to shift to the left. Okay, so in general, if you have a factor that affects supply as opposed to demand, just remember an increase is going to shift the supply curve to the right, a decrease is going to shift it to the left. Okay, let's think of some more factors then. Again, I like some of these, or I think it's more helpful to think about some of these to begin with than others. The first one, it says the prices of productive resources. Really, it would be more helpful if it just said costs. If that one, instead of saying the prices of productive resources, because there's a bit of confusion between what economists mean by prices and what they mean by costs, and that's an area of confusion. I'll come to that in a second. I would think of that as costs rather than the prices of productive resources. Two ways of saying the same thing. But suppose, so when a firm's producing goods and services, it incurs costs. Right? It has to pay for its labor, it has to pay for its raw materials. Okay, so suppose that those costs have increased. Okay, in other words, something's happened that makes production a bit less profitable than it was before. Which way is the supply curve going to shift? To the left, because it's going to reduce supply. So if the costs that a firm face, here it says the prices of productive resources, I wouldn't put it like that, but that's not wrong, but it's just not the way I'd put it. If those costs increase, the supply curve would shift to the left. If they fall, if it becomes cheaper to produce whatever it is we're producing, the supply curve will shift to the right. Okay, let's miss out a few. Let's take number 5, which I referred to in my previous example on the previous slide. A technological innovation. Right now, technological innovations, they generally speaking only go one way. So we tend to have improvements. So technology doesn't get worse, does it? We don't tend to forget things. So if there's a technological innovation that makes production cheaper or more efficient, which way is the supply curve going to shift? To the right. Okay, it's going to increase supply. Take number 6, natural factors. So I had the example of bad weather reducing the supply of crops. So let's take a different example. Suppose you had a very sunny summer, and that was fantastic for wheat. So loads and loads of wheat grows in the sunshine. Then that would shift the supply curve to the right. So for me, the ones which I would start off by thinking of are 1, 5, and 6. Number 4, the number of suppliers. Well, if there are more suppliers in the market, the supply is going to go up. So that would increase the supply, shift the supply curve to the right. So if more firms come into a market and supply more of whatever it is, that's a rightward shift in the supply curve. If producers leave the market, then the supply curve shifts to the left. The supply reduces. So that's a useful one for a few weeks' time. Let's take number 3, expected future prices. Okay, so suppose that you're a producer and you think the prices of whatever it is that you supply, they're going to fall next period. They're going to go down. What are you going to do this period? You're going to supply more, aren't you? You're going to think, oh, well, hang on a second. We need to offload this stuff while the going is good, while the prices are still high. Next period, they're going to be low. So if you expect the future price to decline, that's going to increase the supply in the current period, and the supply curve is going to shift to the right. Okay, the opposite is true. If you expect the future price to rise, so next period the price is going to be higher, you say to yourselves, I'm going to hang on now. I'm not going to supply it now. I'm going to wait till next period. I'm going to get a better price. So if you expect future prices to rise as a supplier, that would reduce the supply in the current period. Okay, so we've done everything but 2, which I've kind of left off. I don't think I really want to talk about 2, but just to give you an idea of what it's about, suppose you're a business and you can make more than one thing. Okay, so in production, maybe you have to choose between making good A and good B. So they're kind of substitutes for one another. If you want to, I wouldn't think about substitutes and complements in relation to supply. I think it'll confuse you. But if we're going to do that, let's just do it briefly, and then we never do it again. Okay. So my firm could be producing A, could be producing B. Let's think of A as being the thing, right? If the price of B goes up, then we might think, oh, well, we want to produce more B, and we'll produce less A. So if the price of a substitute in production rises, you'd produce less of the thing, less of A. On the other hand, if the price of a complement in production rises, if somehow you produce the things together, then if the price of a complement rises, then that would increase the supply of whatever our thing is, shift the supply curve to the right. Okay, I wouldn't worry about that one too much, but maybe it'll come in handy at some point. But as I said, I did them in the order in which I think they're useful, the most important ones first. Okay. The next slide is, again, for people who are a bit phobic about maths, you just don't have to do this if you don't want to. There are some questions on it in terms of seminar questions, but one can live without it. However, if you wanted to use algebra to think about supply and demand, and we were going to assume that the supply curve is linear, a straight line, which it doesn't have to be, but suppose we assume it, then you would write its equation as is written on this slide. P is equal to C plus DQS. And in the same way that I reorganized the equation for the demand curve, you could reorganize that equation so it's easier to interpret. And if you reorganized it, it would be QS is equal to P over D minus C over D. Okay, now what that says in words is that the quantity supplied depends positively on the price, which we've already said in words. Okay, but anyway, that's just there for information. if you like mathematics, you'll be able to understand that easily. And if you don't like it, then you won't. And that's fine. That's not a big problem. So the thing that is important now is we've done demand, we've done supply. So we've done the background carefully. And what supply and demand is useful for is when you put supply and demand together and to describe what's going on in the market.